Welcome everyone to Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson working on American foreign policy with a special focus on Europe and also the Middle Eastern security architecture. It's my pleasure to moderate today's event entitled Taking Stock of China's Emerging Middle Eastern Kingdom. We have a great lineup for you today, starting with one of our three panelists, Mike Doran, who's a colleague of mine at Hudson Institute, also a senior fellow. He's an academic by training, having earned his PhD from Princeton University. His most recent book is Ike's Gamble. I always have to put a plug in for books when they're published, since they're such hard work. And he's known around Washington as really a veteran analyst and policymaker on Middle Eastern issues, having served in the George W. Bush administration on the National Security Council as Senior Director for Middle Eastern Affairs and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Mike has also taught at Princeton and Central Florida University and has been at several think tanks, including the Brookings Institution and now at Hudson. We also have a colleague, as it were, from Princeton, Bernard Haykel. Professor Haykel received his PhD from Oxford University in Oriental Studies. He is now professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton and directs the Institute for Trans-Regional Studies of the Contemporary Middle East. His most recent book, he edited Saudi Arabia in Transition, and also is the author of Revival and Reform in Islam. Professor Haykel is a known expert on the Arabian Peninsula, really the wider Middle East, but in particular, the Arabian Peninsula. So thanks to you both for joining us, but let's get started with Shii Wang, who is a PhD candidate at Princeton University in the history department, where he is looking at Eurasia and governance structures in Eurasia. Many of you will know him because as part of his PhD research, he traveled to Iran in 2016 twice, the second time in May, where he was then detained for over 3 years. Upon his release, he became, I think one can say, something of a media sensation in the US. You may have seen him on CBS Evening News, amongst other programs. And it's really a thrill to have Shii Wang with us today to talk about China in the Middle East. Part of the hook for today's event is most recently, less than a month ago, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's trip to Tehran, where he signed a cooperation agreement with Javad Zarif at the Foreign Ministry. The specifics of that deal have not been released, but it's been reported out that it includes large-scale foreign direct investment into Iran, and in return, the Iranians are offering discounted energy to China. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to gather some experts on China and the Middle East writ large, and talk about the shifting geopolitical sands of the Middle East. So let me start with Shii, given your incredible background and story. Perhaps for those who don't know of your plight, you could talk a little bit about your story, about what it was like to travel to Iran for research and for language studies, and then suddenly to find yourself jailed for over 3 years.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for having me. It's a really pleasure to be at this event. If I can start, in early 2016, that's right after the JCPOA, the signing and the conclusion and the implementation of the JCPOA, at the encouragement of my university, I went to Iran to do a language study at the same time to explore research opportunities. My experience in Iran was rather positive in the beginning, until in the end of July, when I was about to return to the United States. My passport was confiscated by the Iranian intelligence, as it turned out later. And 18 days later, I was arrested by the Iranian intelligence. And then there in the Avian prison, I spent 40 months. And
just to clarify real quick, that passport's an American passport, right? Because you're Chinese by birth, but American by choice. You're naturalized in 2009.
Yes. So I'm actually not a dual national. I'm only American by law. So the Iranians took my American passport first, and then after they arrested me, they made it clear that you have been arrested because you are American, and we want to convict you and then do a deal, a prisoner swap, and money, Iranian assets to be released from America. So and then you have to be here. Had you been a Chinese, none of this would have happened. They made it very clear to me, plain and clear, when I was under interrogation. So there I was convicted of 10 years of sentence, imprisonment under trumped up espionage charges. I spent 3 years and 4 months in Avian prison, and I got released in December 2019 as a result of Iran-US prisoner swap deal. And then since I have returned to the United States, I've been trying really hard to resume my study. Under the COVID, it's difficult, but I think I'm making some headways. And then since later last year, I started becoming very vocal in terms of the United States Iran policy, because as I sensed under the Biden administration, we're taking a sharp turn in our policy orientation towards Iran. And then in my opinion, it is important that I share my insights and the lessons learned in Iran to inform better understanding to our public, to American public and our policymakers on Iran. And then especially now, I think Iran, China have become a important issue, as we have to deal both with Iran and China on the top of our policy, foreign policy agenda. So I think this is an important discussion that we should be having.
Well, great. Maybe we could just delve right into that then. I mean, what assumptions did you have about I suppose, the country and its position in the Middle East heading into your second research trip? And what insights did you develop there while in prison that you've exited with and that you're now taking to the public stage?
Two aspects I want to talk about here. So one is that I went into Iran from a purely academic position, and as you can imagine, in the academic setting, we tend to talk about U.S. wrongdoing, history of imperialism, colonialism in the Middle East, and how this history can explain away and everything bad happened in the Middle East, particularly, let's say, jihadism or Islamic fundamentalism as a reaction to imperialism. And then in the case of Iran, I think it is really a common argument, almost a platitude, almost a platitude that everything bad happened in Iran can be explained away with 1953 onwards. The coup against Mossadegh. And then and I really believed when I went to Iran that the JCPOA was a critical step to right the U.S. wrong, America's wrong in the Middle East, particularly in regard to Iran. And then that would, as the Obama administration envisaged, change the Iranian regime's behavior. And I betted my personal well-being and my academic future on that belief. And I went there, but it was not what happened to me directly contradicted to my belief that if we right or wrong, that they would change their behavior. Because in the prison, I came to the understanding that by believing as such, we in academia we have taken away the agency of local actors and emphasize on the agency of the West, whereas we completely ignore that the Iranians have an interest of doing what they do against us. But we blame ourselves for the situation because we're not trying hard enough. So I think that's Iran's understanding, and then based on my experience, and I try to share with it, I try to share with the public about it, and hopefully with events as such, I will be able to reach further, a bit broader audience. I think it is really important for us to understand that the Iranians and the mullahs, they've got their agency, and then there are certain things that they do. No matter what we do, we cannot change them.
Are these conclusions that you reached sort of in almost solitary thought, contemplating what was going on, or were there interactions that shaped you as well? Or was it just the material fact that you've been unjustly, unfairly imprisoned as part of a pawn on the geopolitical chessboard as a point of leverage? Or were there sort of anecdotes that you would share that you think changed your mind on American strategy?
Yes, and of course, a lot of my understanding, the way that my understanding has changed comes from the very fact that I was unjustly detained, but also a lot of it came slowly through my interaction with the Iranian officials and the intelligence, the judiciary authorities, and also many Iranians who were jailed with me. Many of them were former officials, regime insiders, and then religious extremists, and journalists, scholars, activists, really Iranians from all walks of life. So I really learned a lot by interacting with them, spending a long time, hearing them, hearing what they have to say about their understanding of the situation, their understanding of Iran's recent history and Iran's interaction with the outside world, with China, with America. And so this is the first, to one of your questions, and then to your another question in relation to China. I had a really interesting experience in Iran because I had no logistic support when I arrived in Tehran. I had literally no place to live. So I had to mobilize my contacts in China. And in fact, I spent a month in a major Chinese company's guest house in Tehran. So I stayed with the Chinese, a major state-owned Chinese company and their employees, and then I used to go to Chinese gatherings in local restaurants and places. I really learned a lot about the Chinese business interest in Iran and how Chinese business interests, how Chinese businesses interacted with Iran, and then I think that's really informative. Now, as I put this experience and knowledge into the context we're talking about, the China-Iran deal that has been just signed last month.
I'm tempted to urge you to ditch your original PhD dissertation idea and just write on this, because I think a lot of academics would I mean, painfully assembled, but would really would be jealous about some of the insights you've developed and some of the contacts you've made and some of the things you saw. So let's come back to that in a minute, but let's open up the discussion, and let me go first to Mike Doran, who last August worked with me on an essay, which the title of which we stole for this event today, called "China's Emerging Middle Eastern Kingdom," published in Tablet. And it posits that China is really working with ruthless determination to insinuate itself in the Middle East, and that Iran would be a major partner for China. Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you understand China's role in particular in the Middle East, about where the Middle East stands today, and give us some insight there.
Thanks, Peter. What I saw you and I doing in that essay was really just trying to shake people up a little bit, because there's a kind of consensus that has taken over the policy world, and it's been in place for decades, which says that all China wants from the Middle East is resources, and that it has overlapping interests, strategic interests with the United States. It doesn't want to get involved in the security issues of the region, and it is quite happy to be able to make economic deals with all actors across all divides, ethnic divides, religious divides, geostrategic divides, and just make economic deals and extract resources. And if the United States is the one that takes care of the security questions, that suits China. That suits China quite well. But you know, I was really struck personally by the difference in the role once you and I started looking at this question, the difference in the role that the Chinese are playing today from the one they were playing 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, a good point of departure is the assumptions that we had when I was working in the Bush White House about China. That the assumption was they have no interest in involvement in anything. They just want to extract resources. All that I just said. And as I went and started reading some of the later reports coming out of even institutes that are associated with the Defense Department, all of those same assumptions also coming out of the European think tanks, all of those same assumptions were being recycled over and over again. But the world had changed dramatically. The Chinese now have a base in Djibouti. Djibouti is, less than 20 miles from Yemen, but it's in Africa technically, so it doesn't get categorized in the minds of Americans as a Middle Eastern base, but it's clearly a Middle Eastern base, and it's clearly guarding the approaches of through the Red Sea of the Suez Canal from the Indian Ocean. The Chinese are building this string of pearls across the Indian Ocean, and they're barreling down on the Indian Ocean from Pakistan. And then when you also look at the balance of power in East Asia, and you realize that how dependent China and all of its rivals in East Asia are on oil that either comes from the Middle East or goes through the Middle East, you realize that there really can't be this kind of neat distinction that people got accustomed to making, whereby, yes, the United States is in a hard power rivalry with China in East Asia, but not in the Middle East. In the Middle East, it just kind of ends suddenly. Given the resources that China needs and the threat to its supply lines and the potential threat that it can pose to the supply lines of its enemies, you realize that this can't possibly be. The Chinese have to see this as a kind of continuum. And then, of course, we also have the Belt and Road Initiative and some other things that the Chinese have been doing. Not least of all is this agreement with the Iranians to see that they are really actually insinuating themselves now into the security structures of the region. They're starting to get involved in intelligence and in military affairs, talking about mediating in the Arab-Israeli conflict, things that just a few years ago, like I say, were not at all possible to think about. And behind all that, you have to recognize that there is a US-China rivalry, and that ultimately, the Chinese do want to oust the United States from the Middle East. That's not to say that's their only interest. They do have all of those interests about extracting resources that people have traditionally emphasized are very real. There's no doubt about that at all. And there's no doubt about the fact that they do benefit to a certain extent from or to a considerable extent from the American order. And they're not interested in just toppling the American order or going directly after the United States right now. That would not be in their interest. They're balancing the desire to undermine the United States, the desire to reduce the threat, strategic threat to them that the United States poses in the Middle East, with their need to extract resources. And for me, I mean, the great thing about the Iran relationship for them, the thing that for me symbolized it the most, is that the information that you and I dug up about the investment of the Chinese in Iraq. I mean, as you know, Peter, you and I were both shocked by this. I called up a lot of my friends who are experts on the Middle East and said, in what country has the Chinese investment increased by 1,000% over an 8-year period from 2010 to 2018. Nobody said Iraq. It's just very striking to me that the Iranians have made Iraq completely inhospitable to American business, but they're the Chinese. They're working comfortably. I don't think that that's an accident at all. So I think the United States has to be very, very much aware of the fact that there's a real security threat coming from the Chinese, that there's a threat to our position in the Middle East. They are now the #1 trading partner of almost every country in the region. I think every country but Israel, and they're very high on the list of Israel's trading partners. We cannot compete with them economically, but we do have this hard power advantage in a lot of respects, and they are vulnerable to us. Their supply lines because of that hard power advantage. So I think we should think very, very carefully about how we maintain that edge and recognize, first of all, recognize that we are in the Middle East to compete against China. That's a major issue, and to maintain our edge, and not to make some of the ridiculous errors that we make. I was listening to Shii Wang talk about the assumptions in academia about the behavior of the Iranians. I think there are those assumptions in academia. They don't remain just in academia. They bleed into our political world, and they bleed into the policy world. And then there are some kind of assumptions about Iran's behavior, which may not necessarily be exactly parallel to the academic assumptions, but they're informed by them, or they're kind of analogous to them. And that's what I see the Biden administration doing right now. I think they are exactly as Shii Wang said, that they are, the Biden administration is opening up to Iran and believing that by making a lot of unilateral gestures to Iran, they are somehow going to create a partnership that will never, ever, ever emerge. We can talk. I don't want to, I've talked enough. I think we can go back later about why I think that partnership, I think they're looking for a partnership, and I don't think it will ever emerge. We could discuss that maybe the next go around.
I think that's a great point you make, Mike, about shaking things up and that being one of the intentions of our essay, because once these assumptions are really in place, they're incredibly difficult to dislodge, irrespective of how much evidence accrues against the prevailing wisdom. I actually recently published what I consider something of a companion piece to that China and the Middle East paper. It's on China and Europe. And after an event, I was berated by a European intellectual who accused me of basically practicing polemics in the piece. The piece takes, I think, a bit of a harder line and has a different starting point in its assumptions on China. But here was a sinologist whose entire field over the past 10 years has persistently gotten China wrong on the cautious side, on the milder side, berating me despite their own flaws for having one article published that comes in a little bit more hawkish and a little bit on the harder side. And when time and again, China has basically outperformed each of these predictions. So shaking things up sometimes isn't such a bad thing, and that might be part of the role of think tanks. But from think tanks back to academia, Professor Haykel, you're known as an expert of the Arabian Peninsula. So maybe I'll just throw that out there. What's the view of Beijing from the Gulf, from the Arabian Peninsula?
Thank you, Peter. So I think a couple of structural issues have to be, I'd have to explain first before I launch into how things are seen. In terms of a country like, let's say, Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Kuwait, the relationship with the West, and in particular with the United States, is extremely strong and deep. It has to do with the elites of these countries being oriented towards the US, educated in the US. When they think of business, when they think of law, they're basically dealing with Western business and American lawyers. I mean, their whole orientation is towards the United States. And doing business with the Chinese is not easy. Not just because of the cultural differences, but because the elites of the GCC are not really oriented towards China. And so, for instance, when the Saudis go to build a refinery in China, which they have done, and which took a very long time to do because trust was not there. It took a long time to build. And the Chinese are very careful not to let the Saudis into their local market. So for instance, Saudi Aramco has wanted not just refineries in China, but actually wanted to go into retail, into the retail business in selling oil, and that, which is where most of the money can be made. And the Chinese would not allow that to happen. They're still not allowing that to happen. So there is a lot of, there are kind of structural problems in that relationship. Now that said, I think the view of, let's say, a country like Saudi Arabia has been that once President Obama came to power, actually even before that with President Bush, there was a feeling that the US, especially under Obama, was talking about pivoting to the East and abandoning the Middle East. And this is, of course, language that we now hear in full force with the Biden administration. And so if you're Saudi Arabia, or if you're the UAE and the Americans are telling you, we want out of here, then you have to hedge. You have to hedge your bets. You have to start, flirting with the Russians, flirting with the Chinese, to think of alternatives. That's a difficult thing to do practically because, for instance, in the case of the Saudis, almost all their equipment, their military equipment, is American and British. And you can't just buy Chinese kit and have it, or Russian kit and have it on the ground there and not really break ties with the US military and with the Americans. So that's another, by the way, another structural feature. But having said that, now how does Riyadh see China? Aside from the fear of what's going on in America and the desire to hedge, you also look at China and you say, okay, I don't want the Chinese-Iranian relationship to be super profitable and and really good for the Chinese. I'm going to try to make Iran look as bad as possible to the Chinese and lure the Chinese into Saudi Arabia with investments and all kinds of opportunities. So we see, for instance, the Chinese now are involved in uranium mining and extraction in Saudi Arabia. They're involved in all kinds of infrastructure projects as well. And it's the way kind of typically that happens with the Chinese. They come in that way, and then the politics and the influence comes later. That seems to me to be the pattern. Now, looking at it, and I'm not an expert on China, but looking at it from China's perspective, you're a free rider because the Americans are providing all the security. The question is, you don't trust the Americans, and eventually you want to displace the Americans. So how does that switch go from being the free rider to being the replacement? And that transition is, I think, a very complicated and opaque one. And it's one in which the Chinese are constantly hinting at, but never being very clear about. And we also, I think, from the United States perspective, are sending lots of mixed messages. And that's creating a considerable amount of confusion for our allies in the region.
That's fascinating. Shii, how do you see China's position in the Middle East, or in Iran in particular? And then maybe you could also, since we've touched so much on China's influence flowing first through money and business and then the political influence following, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you did learn, given that you were camped up and housed by Chinese business for a little while in Tehran.
Well, thank you. So I just want to share a little bit of my observations of China's interest in the Middle East. I do think that China's priority now in the Middle East is to have a steady supply of energy to fuel China's economic growth and a kind of a semi-peace in the region, conducive for China's commercial interest. Here, I think it really fits really well with Mike has said in Iraq, right? So where most foreign business, European foreign business were kept out, where the Chinese business are growing, Chinese commercial interests are growing really fast. And then because I think due to that kind of not entirely peaceful, but not also entirely in a conflict situation. I think this particular semi-peaceful situation in the region makes it very good ground for China to expand its interest. And then also that another thing that we should keep in mind is that we have China's developing more or less balanced bilateral relations, at least at the current stage, with all regional powers. So you see, for example, you see even in the most recent trip by the Chinese foreign minister, he visited 6 countries in this trip, and then he signed real deals with countries like UAE and Oman, and then had a high-profile interview with Saudi Arabia, with Al Arabiya. But we can get into that a bit later, I believe. The signing of the China-Iran deal is kind of a murky business where there's no press conference after the signing. Both Chinese and the Iranian foreign ministers declined to speak to the media. And then there's no concrete deal signed under this bigger agreement. And then the content of that is purposefully kept concealed. And then, just again, put things in perspective, or China signed a major deal with the UAE to produce the COVID vaccine. I think that's still, I think that deal is between Sinopharm and then UAE. But in fact, when Iran asked China to sell Iran vaccines, COVID vaccines, China is hesitated. China didn't really want to sell Iran the vaccines because China has its commercial considerations. Today I just read Iran had to buy vaccines from Russia because Chinese company Sinopharm didn't want to sell them. So this, I think, shows something about the nature, the depth of China-Iran relations in reality. So we really have to kind of go beyond the high-profile, almost, in my opinion, kind of like a public relation political gambit of the China-Iran deal. So, and then now we also have to look at what is the Iranian interest. So the Iranian interest in the Middle East is first of all regime survival. Regime survival for the Islamic Republic is at the top. We can't talk about anything else if the regime is in a precarious situation. The second is to expand the Iranian power in the region at the cost of its neighbors and the United States. And then here, and we see a problem. How much does the Chinese interest align with the Iranian interest in this regard? It's really problematic. And then I would argue that China and Iran share less common interest, or let's say the interest between Iran and China is not as deep as many would assume, because they're not neighbors. And then, so if we look at China's relation with North Korea, I think it's more. I think it's the Chinese cooperation and interest in North Korea geopolitically is a lot deeper, because they're bound together geographically, where China and Iran does not have that kind of relation. So this is something we really need to keep in mind. And also want to share a little bit about what I've seen in Iran in terms of Chinese commercial interest. So that is when the JCPOA was signed, the JCPOA wasn't actually a signed document, but when the JCPOA was implemented, the Chinese president was the first world leader to visit Iran. And then I think I first arrived in Iran just a few days, 2 days after Xi Jinping. And then he was very enthusiastic, and then there was a big delegation with him of Chinese businesses. And then they really wanted to deepen their grip of the Iranian market. And Iran also promised that they will work more closely with China. And China rightfully thought during the sanctions, for example, the China-Iran bilateral trade was at its peak in 2014 after the most severe US sanction kicked in 2013. So China thought, we have helped you guys so much, and then now you should kind of work more closely with us under the JCPOA. But that's not exactly how things panned out. Talking to a lot of Chinese business people in Tehran, I learned that well, China's interest is to deepen its grip of Iranian market. The Iranian interest is actually at odds with the Chinese interest. The Iranians wanted to diversify its options when it had the European international access to international market. A case in point where the Chinese CNPC really wanted the South Pars natural gas field in the Gulf. But the Iranians gave the project to Total, French Total. It did not give the project to China, despite that China has been working on this, trying to get it for many years, right? And also a major a Chinese company told me they sent a representative to Iran, and then the representative told me over dinner that they were really trying to offer their service to the Iranians, but the Iranians were really lukewarm because they wanted to do the deal to sign a contract with a Swedish company, where the Chinese were telling the Iranians our price is a half of the Swedish company, or expertise maybe a little bit less sophisticated than the Swedish, but were perfectly capable and competent, and then. But the Iranians were not interested in having the Chinese company doing the deal, doing the project, and then this was across the board. Many Chinese companies share the same concern that when Iran had an opportunity to work with the West, they would opt with working with the West instead of working with China. And then this was something really not expected by a lot of Chinese businesses, and also something that Western analysts tend to overlook.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And maybe I could quickly go to Professor Haykel, because you described this framework of transitioning from free rider to replacement power in the Middle East as a way to think about China's approach to the region. You've described some of the economic relationships on the Arabian Peninsula. Xiyue just talked about some of the European-Chinese competition over Iranian markets. How long is this sustainable for China as it moves up or through that ladder from free rider to replacement power? If it's establishing an actual Chinese order, can it still spread around investments and economic links with all these actors, or is there a moment of choosing, or is that even sort of an inappropriate way to think about this?
I think that Middle Eastern countries, especially the Gulf countries, know that the Chinese don't have the force projection or presence or will that the U.S. has displayed in the past. My feeling is that the Chinese will probably, first of all, their interests are, on the Straits of Malacca, on Taiwan, areas that are closer to home. But my sense is that if let's say, hypothetically, a war were to break out in the Gulf, I suspect that the Chinese initially would probably want to do something that we saw the Japanese do and the Germans when Iraq invaded Kuwait, which is namely to bankroll American military power to bring order and stability back to the region. Simply not because they would necessarily like to do that, but they would need to do that, and because they don't have the force projection to bring order and stability to the region. The other kind of issue, and I think it's a very important one, which is that even the Iranians, as well as of course all the GCC countries, the Saudis and so on, understand that America is not a mercantilist power. America believes in maritime security, the free flow of goods, the capitalist system that the US inherited from the British. And that everyone has sort of thrived and done well under that. The Chinese are not clear about their commitment to those principles. If you look at how they behave in Africa, they often, get hold of assets and commodities and in order to extract them for the Chinese market, right? These are not commodities that are being exploited and then put on the international market for trade. And so their model is a very different one, and I think it's one that both the Iranians and the Saudis would be very wary of and not want to have, dominate, and because that would radically alter, the nature of and the profitability of these goods and these commodities that are produced in the Gulf.
It's one thing to hedge, another to prefer the alternative, I suppose. Yeah. All right, Mike Doran, after the talks between Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage, Alaska, the first major high-level meeting aside from the president's call with Xi, Secretary Blinken put out a statement, which I know you're in violent disagreement with if anyone follows Doran and made it on Twitter, and that is that he sees the US and China as having overlapping interests on a host of issues, including Iran. Maybe that's a way of just putting the question to you of what is the Biden administration up to? You left us with a bit of a cliffhanger in the first round in the Middle East, and perhaps you could bring China into the equation there.
The Biden administration is working with a theory that doesn't have a name. I'll give it a name now. The realignment. And this is a theory that Barack Obama first developed under Obama in the Obama administration. And it's that the Iranian-US conflict is the result of the paranoia, the ambitions, the neurotic fears of America's allies, in particular the Saudis and the Israelis, but not only. And that if the United States will distance itself from the ambitions and fears of its allies and show that to Tehran, then it can create a space for regional stabilization. This is the whole theory of the Biden administration, that there's a smarter way to bring stability to the Middle East, and we can actually decrease our military commitment to the region by increasing our diplomatic activity, and that's a code, diplomatic activity. Anything that begins with a D in the language of the Biden administration: diplomacy, de-escalation, dialogue. What that means is tilt away from the allies and toward Iran. So the first thing they did when they came in is they said to Saudi Arabia, you need to have a regional dialogue with the Iranians. You need to de-escalate in Yemen. Basically, the Americans are telling the Saudis to get out of Yemen, and the Americans are presenting the Yemen conflict as the result of the Saudis, and not the result of the Iranians. And they're basically, without admitting it, because they hide behind this de-escalate, dialogue, diplomacy language, they're actually recognizing the Iranian position, that is, the Iranians supporting the Houthis in Yemen, as legitimate, and the position of our allies, the Saudis, who actually border Yemen, as illegitimate. That is what they're saying, without using those words. And they believe that by doing that, they truly will de-escalate the situation, and then they can broker a modus vivendi between the Saudis and the Iranians, and between the Israelis and the Iranians, and so forth. There are a couple of things that are wrong with this theory. I'm sure that my colleagues here will have things to say about it as well. But I'll just name two things that are obviously wrong with it. Actually, three things, because I want to disagree a little bit politely with our guest, Shii Wang. The first thing is, you can't cut a deal with Iran. And you can't cut a deal. People often say because it's an extremist, a radical, Shiite extremist, radical Islamic regime. That's true, but that's not the heart of it. I mean, that's not all of it. That's not the sum of it. It's also this is a regime that has blackmail and extortion in its heart. And these, when it does things like takes an American student and throws them in jail in order to get sanctions relief, or to get Iranian spies out of America, real spies out of American jails, that's not a tactic that it can dispense with use on one day and dispense with on another day. That is an expression of who the regime is. Khamenei, when he's looking at all the militias that they have built in Iraq, he can't turn around to the head of the Quds Force and say, you know what, let's stop with the militia development. Let's do some military to military capacity building. They can't do that because they don't have a military. He doesn't say, let's stop with the kidnapping and the terrorism and let's do some business development. They don't have these muscles. The muscles that they have are, it is a nation, it is a state. It's a regime that works on extortion principles. That's why they love their nuclear program so much. It's why they'll never give it up. Because what is the nuclear program? It's a big extortion device for extorting, getting influence and goods out of others. So the idea that we're going to cut a deal with them and they're going to help us stabilize Yemen, are they going to help us stabilize Iraq? We already have direct experience of that. Obama pulled out precipitously from Iraq on the theory, he never announced it, but it was very clear on the theory that the overlapping interests, supposedly, so this is an academic theory, not perceived reality, that on the theory that the Iranian interest in stabilizing Iraq overlaps with the American interest, and so we can cut a deal with them. It's not going to happen. The other two factors, just quickly, this theory that our allies are pulling us into a conflict with Iran is nonsense. The Iranians see themselves as in a conflict with the United States. The Iranians are attacking Saudi Arabia and they're attacking Israel because those states are tied to the United States, not because let's say the Americans are not being tarnished by their association with Saudi Arabia in the eyes of the Iranian. It's the opposite. So it's a completely misunderstanding of what's going on. There's a struggle for regional order between the United States and the Iranians. And when we define the problem as a Saudi-Iranian relationship conflict, or an Israeli-Iranian conflict that we're getting sucked into, we have actually advantaged the Iranians by misidentifying the conflict and misidentifying in a way that benefits them greatly, because then it leads us to do stupid things like denigrate our own allies publicly and demand that they make unilateral concessions to the Iranians that will never be reciprocated. The last point, just a slight disagreement with Shii Wang. I agree with everything that he said. How could I disagree? he sat, in Iran talking to these Chinese businesses and so forth. I just think there is actually a strategic brain in Beijing that is working over the commercial calculations. I'm not saying that there aren't these commercial calculations, and I'm not saying that they don't lead to all kinds of tensions. And I'm not at all saying for a second that the Iranians aren't always looking for ways to maximize their autonomy. They don't want to be totally under the thumb of the Chinese by any stretch of the imagination. But you have to step back and look at this and see, very important, that the Chinese are developing a security relationship with the Iranians that is different than they have with anybody else in the region. And the reason for that is Professor Haykel said at the beginning, when he described how the Saudis, when they see that security relationship developing, what do? They run to Beijing. They run to Beijing and they try to pull the Chinese toward them. So the Chinese are very much aware of this, that if they threaten indirectly, if they use Iran as a stalking horse, everyone who's threatened by Iran will come to Beijing for help. Unless, and this is the key thing, and I'll stop here, unless the United States can help them. So, but what if you're Saudi Arabia and you're sitting there and you see that rising threat of the Iranian-Chinese relationship, and what happens when you turn to Washington? Washington tells you, either you sit down and talk to the Iranians or we're going to pull the American security guarantee from you. That is what we are saying to them. That's what we are signaling to them right now. It's the absolute dumbest possible move we can make. We are handing our allies to Beijing, or to improve their relationship with Beijing, on a platter. It's crazy.
Shii, do you want to offer some thoughts on the JCPOA, what Mike just said, anything else that you'd like to touch on?
Oh, well, actually, I really quite agree with Mike in his observation. That in fact, I neglected that, didn't make the point that one of the objectives, Chinese objectives in the Middle East is leverage. If you don't, for example, in the case of Iran, China is always having the opportunity or the possibility of using Iran as a leverage against the United States, and that's obvious. The whole China-Iran deal is a big part of that is leverage. But also China could use that to leverage its relations with the UAE, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia. So in that regard, I do agree with Mike. But just let me make some observations. If you look into what the Biden administration is saying, and then you compare it with what the Iranian regime is saying, and you see they're strikingly similar. We're basically talking their talking points. Iran, first of all, maximum pressure campaign has failed, and then Iran is closer than ever to a breaking out point, and then the world is less safe than JCPOA was in place. And these things are exactly what the regime is saying. In the Iranian New Year address, actually, the maximum pressure campaign has failed is the very first point Khamenei has made. And then this is also the very first point that Rob Malley, the Iran envoy, has made. So how do you square it, right? And today, something really interesting as I see it, is that the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran has, as it is negotiating with the 5+1 powers in Vienna, it is, and China, Iran is selling more oil to China, and then saying, and then the Wall Street Journal reported by doing so, Iran is getting a lot of leverage over America and showing that it's not solely dependent on the JCPOA and its relation with the outside world. So it has China to get its back. And this is wrong, because the problem is the United States under the Trump administration has brought the Chinese purchase of Iranian oil down to zero. at some point. So we need to really ask why the Chinese are buying Iranian oils like a shopping spree. It really skyrocketed. If you look at the graph, it really skyrocketed since Biden's election, and then the Chinese were buying 500,000 barrels per day in February and 1 million barrels a day in March. Why is that? Because if you read into the analysis and then the trajectory of this Chinese support, so-called Chinese support of Iran, is that our administration, the Biden administration, has showed a clear tendency not to enforce sanction against Iranian oil sale on China. So from the Chinese perspective, you're not enforcing the sanctions and putting more political pressure on Iran, then I would take advantage of that. And guess what? And then the Iranians are and those pro-engagement people in the United States are saying, well, see, maximum pressure campaign has failed. China is benefiting from it. So let's get closer with Iran. And the really ironic part is that, what we should ask is who is giving the Iranians the leverage that they don't really deserve, right? So if America was serious and determined to put pressure on Iran, China wouldn't do that, at least not at this, at this rate, right? So the really strange thing we're seeing is that we're allowing or we're conniving Chinese purchase of Iranian oil, allowing Iran to use that as a leverage against us. So
Peter,
yeah.
Sorry, Peter, can I jump in here and just make put an exclamation point behind everything that Shii Wang just said. I also heard from somebody with access to American intelligence that the Chinese, with regard to this announcing this this cooperation deal, the Chinese decided not to do it under Trump, and they only decided to go forward with it after the Biden administration came in. And I believe that it's exactly for the same calculations that they're making with regard to the skyrocketing oil sales. They do. Back to this question of this contradiction that the Chinese are managing in the Middle East. On the one hand, they benefit from the U.S. security system, and they want stability so that they can do their economic deals and extract their resources. On the other hand, there is a competition with the United States going on. But if the United States is going to simply hand them things and not compete or push allies into their into their lap, they're going to take it. So if the United States is now going to open the door of Iran to investment, the Chinese are going to invest, and they're going to move forward, regardless of the effect it has on the United States. So why we're so oblivious to this, or why it's a good question. I don't think the Biden administration is oblivious to it. I think that they have a self-contained worldview that is just sort of impenetrably ignorant about these kinds of things.
I could bring in Professor Haykel. Professor Haykel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the worldview of the Biden administration and before that of the Obama administration was that these moves, this policy was actually going to bring greater stability to the Middle East. And in fact, what you see is there's a secular trend with this policy that you have much more instability, and also you have local actors, in particular strategic allies, going ahead and doing their own thing. So for instance, the recent Israeli attack on the Natanz was, Israel doing its own thing without any coordination with the United States. And the Saudis, who offered an agreement to the Houthis, a ceasefire agreement, was responded to by an escalation by the Houthis and further drone attacks, Iranian drones, on Saudi Arabia. So what you see is local allies of the United States moving and reacting to this escalation by Iran by escalating themselves. And so we're going to see more instability. and more, unfortunately, more violence, I suspect, as the Biden administration tries to convince us all that what it's trying to bring is stability by opening up to Iran.
So dark times ahead, but to discuss all of that, we'll have to have this all-star Princeton lineup back. I don't think I ever mentioned that, but all three with Princeton affiliations one way or another. Thanks so much, Wang Xiyue, Bernard Haykel, Michael Doran, and look forward to having you join us on a Hudson webcast again another time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.